حي على الفلاح.
Life as we know it today brings with it all sorts of grief and stress and regret. Sometimes this grief is due to a financial worry. Other times it's relating to a health concern. Whilst other times this stress and fear could be because of an enemy who is in the waiting. The stress and grief of dunya comes in many different sizes and shapes and forms. However, regardless of how intense and severe this level of fear and stress and grief may become in the life of a person today, it doesn't usually cause a mother to forget her child. Nor does it usually cause a child to go grey. Nor does it usually cause people to behave as if they are drunk because of the stress and grief. Because these three descriptions that you and I just heard, they are a description of the stress of one day, exclusively one day and one day alone. And that is the day of judgment. Allah Almighty said, depicting the intensity and the fear and grief of that day, He said, on that day you will see every nursing mother forgetting her nursling, and every pregnant woman will drop her load, and you will see people behaving as if they are drunk, but they are not drunk. It is the punishment of Allah Almighty that is severe. So colossal is the stress and fear of that day that Allah Almighty, He said, it is a day that will make children go grey. On that day, humanity in their billions, they will be divided into one of two categories, without a third. The first of these categories is al-aminun, those who are at peace, those who experience security, those who will be experiencing the unthinkable form of happiness during the day of fear. We shall give them security. They are those who singled out Allah Almighty in worship. And they were sincere in everything they did. And they tackled every haram craving, every sinful habit, outwardly, inwardly, publicly, privately. They tackled that sin head on before the meeting of death. The greatest terror, the day of judgment, will not grieve them in the least. Ya salam. As for the second category, it is the polar opposite. They are the terrorized ones. They are al-khaifun. They are an-nadimun, the regretful ones. These are the petrified ones. Their hearts reach their throats, about to exit because of the fear. And they will be in an overwhelming state of hasra, regret, which is the key word for today. So regretful they will be that some of them would have lowered their heads in shame, and they will be heard saying to Allah, "Oh Allah, we now see and we can now hear, so please allow us to return to dunya so that we may do good. We are now very certain." Whilst a second group will be heard screaming out in regret, saying, "How great is our regret because we didn't give this thought." Whilst a third group will be suicidal on the day of judgment, craving for death as they shriek out saying, "I wish I was dust. We wish death was the end," they will say. Regret is the key word for today. Regret is the name of that very powerful emotion, the negative emotion that is, that every one of us has experienced at one level or another. So overwhelming regret can be in the life of a person that if it is not managed with iman and certainty and Quran and salah, a person may become suicidal. In fact, the Harvard newsletter documents the story of an old man who lived in Liverpool. And this was a man who would always choose the exact same set of lottery numbers each week. He wouldn't change, trying his luck, as they say. And on one of those particular days, subhanallah, he forgot to renew his lottery ticket numbers. And what happened? His numbers came up. And this poor man was in such a state of self-blame and regret that he didn't know how to manage this, and so he committed suicide. I mention this because people will wish a similar outcome on the Day of Judgment. People will be pleading with Allah Almighty for death. Why? Because Yawmul Qiyamah is called Yawmul Hasra, the day of regret. That is one of its names. Thus Allah said, warn them, O Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of the day of regret. Warn them whilst people are still asleep and others, they will not believe in Allah. The day of regret. The Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, as Imam al-Bukhari narrates in his Sahih on the authority of Abi Hurairah, giving us one of the harrowing scenes of regret that will appear on this day. He said, there isn't any person who was taken to Jannah on the Day of Judgment except that he has to first see his potential home in Jahannam, the hellfire. Had he failed on that day, so that his heart fills with gratitude to Allah and thanks. And he said, then there isn't any person who was made to enter the hellfire except that Allah will make him see his potential home in Jannah, had he passed on this day, so that he is encompassed with regret and sadness. Allahu Akbar. The Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam has in fact informed us of several matters that will bring hasra, regret, on the Day of Judgment. And we will mention just 6 of those today, so that we know the roadmap, we know exactly how to prepare and to spare ourselves and our families from the regret of the Day of regret. What are these 6 things? Number 1, those who do not give Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2 of the Quran, its due attention. Isn't that a strange one? When the rewards are distributed on the Day of Judgment to the people of the Quran, and specifically to the people of Surah Al-Baqarah, those who had ignored Surah Al-Baqarah will be taken by regret. Thus the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, as Imam Muslim narrates in his Sahih on the authority of Abi Umamat al-Bahili, he said, always recite Surah Al-Baqarah, because taking care of this surah is a barakah, it is a blessing, and not doing so will be a regret on the Day of Judgment. And the magicians are not able to overcome it. As for the second source of regret, this is in relation to any gathering, whether with family or friends or online, where the name of Allah Almighty is not mentioned. Thus the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, as Abi Dawood narrates in his Sunan on the authority of Abi Hurairah, he said, any people who sit in a gathering whereby they do not remember the name of Allah Almighty or mention Him in any way, except that when they leave that gathering, it would have been as if they were sat around the dead body of a donkey. And that gathering will be regret for them on the Day of Judgment. Subhanallah al-Azim. What about number 3? The third cause of regret is with regards to those individuals who aspired for positions of authority. They wanted to be in the limelight. They wanted people to clap for them. They sought after attention and praise. And that is why the Prophet ﷺ, he says, as our mother Aisha narrates, and the hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari, he said, O Muslims, you will soon start competing over positions of authority. And on the Day of Judgment, that's going to bring with it regret. So how great is breastfeeding? And how difficult is weaning? What is that all about, that last sentence? The Messenger ﷺ is comparing positions of authority and those who always want it with the breastfeeding child, who is always receiving its nutrition and its milk readily available from its mother with no effort from itself. But there has to come a day when that child must be weaned, when that milk has to come to a stop, And similarly, those who aspire for positions of authority and status in the community, despite not being deserving of it, are not possessing the credentials, their wealth and their prestige and their honor will have to come to a stop at one point. And that will be on the day of judgment, when wealth and prestige will be replaced with regret for aspiring for a position that you are not fit for. As for the fourth cause of regret, this will be with regards to a person who puts forward acts of worship, but they contain within them hidden elements of showing off. This is a person who has dedicated years upon years of what he called worship and Quran and Salah and Taraweeh and Qiyam and fasting and dhikr and da'wah and a flawless hijab and enjoining good and forbidding evil and Islamic events and Islamic reminders and Islamic posts, and they see these good deeds in the form of mountains on the day of judgment, beautiful mountains, and to his horror they begin to crumble before his very eyes. Can you imagine their regret? That is because those good deeds, although they were huge, but they had holes within them. They were rotten. They had holes of showing off. They had holes of pride, holes of self-admiration, holes of self-promotion. Look at me, what I am doing, what I am up to, where I am found, what I am reciting, where I am praying. Holes of showing off. Thus those deeds come crumbling down on the day of judgment, causing regret. One of the scariest ayat from the Quran, as some of our predecessors they said, they will see with Allah Almighty that which they did not expect. A'udhu billah. As for the fifth cause of regret, this is when you find yourself being forced on the day of judgment to hand over your good deeds to somebody else. Or when you are forced to carry the sins of somebody, sins that you didn't even commit. Can you imagine what that means? Imagine on Yawm al-Qiyamah you are forced by the angels to hand over 2,000, 3,000 prayers to somebody else, to your neighbor. Can you imagine handing over 2 or 3 or 10 Ramadans worth of hard work and thirst and sacrifice?